Department of Heritage Services with the City of Kingston. As always, it's really wonderful to see so many familiar faces, and I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to anyone who's attending this program for the first time. Let's begin with a land acknowledgement. The City of Kingston acknowledges that we are on the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, and thanks these nations for their care and stewardship over this shared land. Heritage Hour invites speakers to share their knowledge on a variety of topics connected to tangible and intangible heritage. Today, we are very grateful to have the opportunity to learn from Dr. Scott Berthelette. Scott Berthelette is a professor in the Department of History at Queen's University. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Saskatchewan. His research and teaching centers on the history of New France, Indigenous peoples, the fur trade, and Euro-Indigenous relations in North America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Berthelette to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Turner, and thank you everyone for being here today to listen to my talk. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, and I'm timing myself, so I'll stick to that. And then we'll have some time for a Q&A afterwards. Forgive me too, I'm not very used to using a microphone, so do I seem to be at a good, okay. I also want to say too, I've shared this research 2 other times. A few months ago in Kingston, I presented this at the People's Symposium in February, and then I presented this again at the Nautical Nights Lecture Series at the Marine Museum. But it was very poorly attended, so I don't know if there's any overlap. So hopefully you're hearing this for the first time, and if you're not, I've tried to include some new information, some new slides, and I think I've refined the talk and maybe provided some more analysis and context for some of the information I'm going to be sharing today. With that being said, I'm just going to jump right into it. In June of 1687, Jacques-René de Brézé de Denonville, who was then Governor General of New France, gathered an army in preparation for war against their enemies, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who the French would have called the Iroquois. Governor Denonville's forces were mustering at a place called Cataraqui, a strategic location where the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario meet. It was here that the French had constructed Fort Frontenac in 1617-3, where the city of Kingston, Ontario now stands. So this, is a very local history connected to us here in Kingston. Denonville's 1687 invasion was meant to deliver a crippling blow to the westernmost nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Seneca. Before the invasion even began, however, Denonville and his military officers captured and arrested hundreds of Haudenosaunee men, women, and children from various communities along the north shore of Lake Ontario who didn't even know they were at war with the French. Notably, Governor Denonville had sent soldiers to destroy the towns of Guineas and Kente and to bring its inhabitants back to Fort Frontenac. I want to show you now a map of some of this history that I've been sharing. This is a map I have a grad student working on for me currently, and he's got pretty good at using some of this mapping technology. This map represents movements of Denonville's army from Montreal to Cataraqui and his eventual crossing of Lake Ontario to invade the Senecas, which he accomplished in July of 1687. It also shows on the dotted line the detachment of soldiers sent to destroy the 2 towns of Guineas and Kente, both on the Bay of Quinte to the west of here. Guineas is more or less present-day Napanee, Ontario. So, also worth mentioning at this time, a peaceful delegation of about 40 Haudenosaunees arriving from Onondaga, the capital of the Confederacy in Upper New York State, were also arrested under the false pretenses of a feast meant to solidify peace and commerce with the French. So this was a complete betrayal by the French. Out of the Haudenosaunee prisoners, 36 men were transported down the St. Lawrence River to Quebec, where they were subsequently shipped to France and forced into servitude and slavery on the Mediterranean galleys of Louis XIV. The French king had explicitly ordered the governor to make a great number of Haudenosaunee galley slaves, even writing, and I quote from the slide here, "Let him," meaning Denonville, "so manage the continuation of this war as to make the greatest number of prisoners possible, as it is certain that these Indians who are vigorous and accustomed to hardship can serve usefully on board His Majesty's galleys." End quote. These 36 Haudenosaunee captives would unwillingly cross the Atlantic through the French port of Rochefort and then onto Marseille, where they rode in the Sun King's galley fleet throughout the Mediterranean for 2 years. So my overall project really centers on the fate and experience of these 36 Haudenosaunee captives, some of whom would eventually make it back to their homes in North America. Whenever I give public history talks about the Haudenosaunee, I like to provide some context. So I'm going to do that on this slide here. At some point prior to European contact, 5 separate nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, came together and formed the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And the original traditional territory of this confederacy was located in upper New York State between the Mohawk River Valley to the east and the Genesee River to the west, as you can see on the map here. The self-designation of Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse, and this term is becoming more commonly used than older European applied names like Iroquois. The Haudenosaunee not only lived in multi-family bark longhouses, but they also likened their entire confederacy to a longhouse, with the Seneca characterized as keepers of the western door, the Mohawk as keepers of the eastern door, and the Onondaga as keepers of the central council fire. Leaders chosen by clan mothers from all 5 nations came together in a grand council at Onondaga to discuss matters of common concern, especially issues that threatened the entire confederacy. So to provide even more context here then, since the beginning of the 17th century, so the beginning of the 1600s, several nations, including the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Innu, Miami, and Illinois, as well as the French, had been periodically at war with the Haudenosaunee. This era of history is sometimes referred to as the Iroquois Wars or the Beaver Wars. By our time, though, the mid-1680s, the Haudenosaunee and French had actually been on peaceful terms for about 20 years. However, the French were watching with growing concern as the Haudenosaunee continued to make wars on their allies and trade partners in the West, notably the Illinois and Miami. And thus the French began to plan this secret war against the Confederacy. For their part, the Haudenosaunee watched with concern as the French began to expand their empire throughout the Great Lakes region and down the Mississippi Valley. A note I do want to make, moving from this slide, the previous slide represented the traditional Haudenosaunee homelands. We do, however, see a dramatic territorial upheaval and expansion throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, and that's why today we have Haudenosaunee communities in Quebec and Ontario, as well as in New York State, right? So we know of, Haudenosaunee, of course, just are our neighbors to the west of here, to us in Kingston. But that's not really a history I'm going to get into today, but I do just want to represent these territorial expansions and movements that happen later on after the period I'm examining. So the overall project centers on this story of captivity and redemption of these Haudenosaunee men. But for today's talk, I want to focus on a few different themes and subjects. So first, I want to look at the experience of the Haudenosaunee captives in France itself. So I want to share basically what I found through my archival research in France, and then to provide some context and analysis to those records. Second, I want to examine the different strategies employed by the Haudenosaunee leadership in North America to compel the French to return their relatives held in captivity overseas. These leaders, I argue, employed a 3-pronged strategy which included military coercion, assertions of neutrality, and requests for the English government to intervene with the French crown on their behalf. I'll go into detail in all 3 of these, but ultimately they seem to have worked, for we do see 13 survivors finally return home in October of 1689. But we turn now in the narrative to the arrival of the Haudenosaunee captives in France in October of 1687 when they disembarked at Rochefort, which is an Atlantic port in France. We have confirmation from the intendant at Rochefort, a guy called Pierre Arnoul, that 36 Haudenosaunee prisoners disembarked, and he was responsible for basically sending them overland to Marseille. And this map here, very basic, but it shows you the exact locations of Rochefort, Marseille, and as well as Paris, which was and still is the administrative center of France. I want to introduce a few French historical actors who end up playing a larger role in this narrative. First, we have Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the Marquis de Seignelay. He is the son of maybe the more famous Jean-Baptiste Colbert you might have heard about. In this period, his son, Seignelay, was the Minister of the Navy and Colonies and oversaw all things related to Canada and New France. Second, we have Michel Bégon, who was the intendant of the galleys at Marseille from 1685 to 88, and he would be responsible for the Haudenosaunee captives in Marseille. And third, we have Yves Laurence, who was the royal chaplain of the galley fleet, who oversaw converting galley rowers to Catholicism, right? We'll get into this a bit more later, but this was a big purpose of France's galley fleet, was the conversion of non-Catholics to Catholicism. The King's Galley Fleet were simultaneously fighting ships as well as penal establishments meant to reform convicts and captives. So we'll discuss this more shortly. Okay, this next slide here shows you a painting of Marseille in the latter half of the 1600s. Around this time, Louis XIV had a fleet of about 50 galleys manned by more than 15,000 men, which included officers, galley chaplains, soldiers, marines, and the oarsmen, of course. And just to cover all my bases here, a galley is a low, flat ship that relied mostly on oars for propulsion and was used in warfare and commerce, mostly in the Mediterranean Sea. And the use of the galley dates back really to antiquity. So this is a very kind of outdated ship as we enter the age of sail for European kingdoms and empires at this time. The base at Marseille was established quite late in 1665 at the behest of Louis XIV. And at this base that we see pictured here, basically the King's Galley Fleet was built and maintained. The sailing fleet was maintained nearby at the port city of Toulon, where there was another military base there. So the French King's Galley Fleet not only defended the coast against piracy and participated in maritime campaigns, but also served as symbols for King Louis XIV, who himself self-proclaimed protector of Catholicism in the Mediterranean through both his enslavement of quote-unquote infidels and through his wars against Ottoman and North African adversaries, using galleys. So in the 17th century, there were two categories of oarsmen in the French galley fleet. There were what was categorized as the esclaves, or the slaves, as well as the forçats, or the convicts. So to begin with the slaves, they belonged to a very broad administrative category of purchased or captured rowers, usually Muslims from North Africa or the Eastern Mediterranean, but also occasionally sub-Saharan Africans bought in Cape Verde or Senegal. Forçats or convicts belonged to a separate category of usually Frenchmen, serving sentences for various crimes, including Christian heresy. In 1685, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes made Protestantism illegal in France, and that swelled the forçat rowing force by imprisoning Huguenots, that is French Protestants, who were unable to flee France or refused to convert to Catholicism. So jointly, these convicts and slaves rowed alongside each other and collectively served as the unfree labor of the galley fleet. Before even arriving at Marseille, convicts and captives had to undergo a long and difficult journey. Chained together in heavy irons riveted around their necks, the captives were forced to march an average of 20 kilometers a day. There were three principal routes that these chains of convicts and slaves took to arrive at Marseille to serve in the galleys. The Haudenosaunee captives would have traveled on the Guyenne or Bordeaux chain that followed the Garonne Valley southeast as far as Toulouse, and then reached the Mediterranean from there. You can see a plausible route that they would have taken from Rochefort to Marseille on this very helpful map from historian Paul Bamford's book, Fighting Ships and Prisons, all about Louis XIV's galley fleet. Given lack of adequate clothing, shoes, and provisions, as well as severe mistreatment by conductors and guards, most chains of prisoners that converged on Marseille had suffered significant casualties. I want to, for example, we know of a chain that arrived at Marseille in 1710 composed of 333 prisoners. 10 had allegedly died on the road, and 46 were immediately taken to hospital for treatment upon their arrival. So this seems to have unfortunately been the norm, even, in the century after, well, not quite the century after, but, 30 or so years after the Haudenosaunee arrival. But we know very little information about what the route would have looked like for the Haudenosaunee, unfortunately. When they did arrive in Marseille, though, most of the recorded information surrounding their activities seems to have dealt with both their dietary and spiritual nourishment. So quite literally what they were eating and whether or not they were converting to Catholicism. So that this was a big concern for French officials. In late 1687 and early 88, Minister Seignelay wrote several letters to Intendant Bégon regarding how he was to care for the newly arrived captives, which seems to have been more lenient than the treatment afforded to other galley rowers. So, for example, December 18th, 1687, the minister wrote, and I think I have the quote on the slide here, quote, "His Majesty wishes that the Iroquois are not chained, provided you are certain they are secure and will not escape, and that they are not to be shaved. But with regard to bread, His Majesty did not think fit to increase the bread ration above that of a forçat, which is considered strong enough to support these Iroquois," end quote. And just over a month after their arrival, however, the rations of the Haudenosaunee captives were indeed increased following petitions of officials at Marseille to the minister. On January 15th of the new year, Minister Seignelay wrote again to Yves Laurence saying, and I quote again, "The king was good enough to consider the request you made of me for the Iroquois, and I indicated to Monsieur Bégon to increase their ration," end quote. So in just a few weeks, the conditions for the Haudenosaunee captives seems to have improved, however, marginally. The image on the screen are orders for how many rations should be distributed to galley rowers when they're on campaign, which was a little better than what they received when they were in port. While they were in port, each galley rower received on average a daily ration of bread, about 900 grams, and a bowl of cooked beans seasoned with olive oil and salt. A French Huguenot survivor of the galleys who wrote about his experiences later in life described the food in this way, and I'll quote from him here. He said, "The beans are ill-boiled, with scarce any oil, a little salt, and all to be eaten out of a cauldron, not the cleanest in the world, as you may easily guess. I was never so hungry, but I preferred eating my portion of bread dipped in vinegar and water to this mess, which even offended the sense of smelling with its unsavory odor. However, these 22 ounces of biscuit are all the food allowed for galley slaves. I once had the curiosity to count the number of beans which a brother slave had got for all his portion, which amounted to just 30, end quote. So a very disgusting, very, very poor diet, as described by this one survivor of the galleys. But as I was saying, the other issue really was about religion. The conversion of the galley rowers, especially of non-Christians, to Catholicism. This could represent a significant spiritual victory for the French king, right? This is really about propaganda for Louis XIV. So their survival was deemed paramount if this spiritual victory would be used to enhance the king's image and reputation. We know in August of 1681 that the La Majeure Cathedral in Marseille hosted a group baptism for 50 enslaved West Africans. These West African galley rowers who converted to Catholicism, the French crown spared little expense in providing extra clothing, a more robust diet, a dedicated interpreter, and indoor accommodations heated by fire during the winter months. So the French crown took an intense interest in their well-being after this group baptism. Likewise, the French crown took interest in the Haudenosaunee captives as well, and their religious salvation became a topic of much discussion in official correspondence. So for these reasons, Minister Seignelay ultimately agreed that, quote, these Iroquois need stronger food than usual, end quote. I wondered if corresponding baptisms likewise happened for the Haudenosaunee captives in Marseille. So far, I've not been able to find any, but that might be because they already profess to be Catholics, at least some of them, and we'll get into this a bit more in the next section, or rather the next slide right away. The Haudenosaunee galley rowers seem to have been familiar with Christian doctrine. They had been exposed to both Jesuit and Sulpician missionaries for many decades in North America. A letter in the French archives attests to this familiarity. And I'll read some of it here. This is from the minister. He says, quote, I was very glad to learn from your letter of the 1st of this month that the Iroquois have some tincture of our religion and that they indicate that they have been baptized. You will have less trouble giving them instructions you deem necessary. Again, in the letter, the minister repeats to not put them in chains, to not shave them, so that there will be no objection to this evangelical work. But he also cautions the galley chaplain to not, treat them too favorably. So there's this line that's being threaded, I guess, by French officials. We've talked about the higher bread ration, but it might be worth noting this reference to not having them shaved. So I'll explore that a bit here. So the head shaving was especially a violent and degrading act that you can see portrayed here on the 18th century painting of galley slaves embarking at the port of Genoa by Italian artist Alessandro Magnasco. So throughout the era of Louis XIV, most galley slaves sported the same look: a shaved head, a red bonnet, stockings, and leather shoes. The distinctive look enabled administrators to distinguish their galley slaves who went ashore and about town, as well as help prevent escapes, as it would be very easy to identify escapees in the surrounding towns and rural communities. For Haudenosaunee men, long hair and braids can be symbolic of strength and wisdom, and they can also be reflective of clan identity. Whether or not officials were aware of this cultural context, they might have believed that the Haudenosaunee captives appeared distinctive enough to evade recapture should they flee. The likeliness of flight was also low, for the Haudenosaunees would not have spoken the language, nor known where and how to flee to safety in the foreign and unfamiliar world of the south of France. While most enslaved galley rowers had their heads shaved, this does not seem to have been the case for the Haudenosaunee captives, at least. I hypothesize what might have aided the Haudenosaunee captives, and I think this maybe seems clear from the archival evidence, is that they professed this knowledge of Catholicism, some even indicating that they had been baptized back in Canada. Others may have allowed galley chaplains to baptize them or confirm their devotion to Christ. For example, we see in the official correspondence that, quote, the Iroquois frequented the sacraments with the devotion they owed, end quote, meaning they would have received communion at Mass. Elsewhere, I noted how the French reported that the Iroquois had some tincture of their religion. So this fact may have given French officials pause that the Haudenosaunee were wrongly imprisoned, or at the very least misclassified. Religion was the basis for distinguishing between convicts and slaves aboard the galleys in the 17th century. This was prior to the emergence of hardening racial and ethnic categories to define slavery throughout France's Atlantic Empire. Slavery aboard Louis XIV's galleys was reserved for infidels, non-Christians, and usually referred to Turks, North Africans, or Sub-Saharan Africans. Back in North Africa, Haudenosaunee, especially those from around the island of Montreal and the north shore of Lake Ontario, had interacted with Christian missionaries for decades, really. Some had converted, others hadn't, but still dabbled in Catholic prayer, ritual, and material culture. This image on screen depicts a scene at the Jesuit mission of Sault Ste. Louis, also called Ganawage. This is a Christian Mohawk community near Montreal that is still there, still near Montreal, Ganawage, thriving Mohawk community. Either way, I think that this spiritual flexibility, or at very least, maybe we could call it religious pragmatism, shown by some of the Haudenosaunee at Marseille might have been a helpful strategy to improve their condition, however marginally. I want to transition now back to North America and to speak about some of the strategies used by the Haudenosaunee to get their relatives back home from captivity overseas. So, I want to begin with this term.
You're welcome to have this one.
Hello? Hello? I don't know what happened.
That's odd. There you go.
Okay.
Try this one.
Hello? Does this work?
It must be the speaker system itself.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
1 second. I'm going to turn this off and turn it on again. So sorry, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm just going to...
Sure thing. I could keep trying to talk. Can you guys hear me in the back? Yeah? Okay. Yeah? Okay. Pardon me?
It's even better without the mic.
Is it?
With the reverberation.
Okay. Maybe we'll try without the mic for a bit. I was finding it kind of awkward, because it moves a bit and then you lose a bit of sound. So going back to North America, I want to speak of the different strategies employed by the Haudenosaunee leadership to bring their relatives back home. And the very first strategy we see is in the 2 months after Denonville's invasion. The Haudenosaunee began ramping up their attacks against the French, essentially giving it right back to them, capturing French men and women in retaliation for the taking of prisoners to the Mediterranean galleys. In August of 1687, 40 warriors from the Mohawk, Onondaga, and Oneida nations captured a number of French soldiers and settlers outside of Fort Frontenac and took them all prisoner. So now, this narrative, we started here at Fort Frontenac, and now we went overseas to France, to the south of France, to Marseille, and now we're back here again. So this is, as I like to sort of explain the project, it's both kind of a local history, but it's also Atlantic in scope as well. So the French soldiers and settlers were captured here by the Haudenosaunee. And the resident chaplain at Fort Frontenac, a guy called Father Jean de Lambertville, attempted to negotiate for the return of these French prisoners. But the Haudenosaunee warriors replied that since the French had so many of their people in custody, they would only return their French prisoners when the French finally returned the Haudenosaunee prisoners. So they were looking to do a bit of a captive exchange. So this strategy differed somewhat from traditional Haudenosaunee wartime objectives of captive taking, which was based on what scholars have called the morning war custom. Essentially, the Haudenosaunee traditionally waged wars of capture meant to replace dead relatives through adoption of captives into Haudenosaunee longhouses, villages, and clans. The laws of war were changing, however, and now some Haudenosaunee seized French prisoners in the hopes of employing them as bargaining chips in future negotiations for the return of their relatives overseas. Around this time, the Haudenosaunee also commenced a 6-month siege of Fort Frontenac. Without being able to leave for fresh provisions and water, scurvy, slowly, the quote on the screen here, recalled how, quote, "The Iroquois have pressed us so closely that we have neither wood, nor water, nor refreshment. Scurvy infected the garrison, which carried off about 100, end quote. The Haudenosaunee were deliberately targeting Fort Frontenac, as one Mohawk diplomat vowed to the English of New York, quote, that the place where the French stole their Indians 2 years ago should soon be cut off, for to steal people in a time of peace is an inconsiderate work, end quote. The almost immediate Haudenosaunee retaliation in the aftermath of Denonville's invasion might have given the French second thoughts on their taking of the Haudenosaunee captives in the first place. To speak now of another strategy that was employed, we see what's been called a Treaty of Neutrality signed at Montreal. This is in June of 1688, so the next summer. We see an Onondaga leader named Outreuti, who the French called La Grande Gueule, or the Big Mouth, approach Montreal with a large contingent of Onondaga, Oneida, and Cayuga warriors. Panicked French officials sent a Jesuit, the same Father Lambertville, who had barely survived his ordeal at Fort Frontenac, to negotiate with Outreuti. Diplomacy succeeded, and nearly 100 Haudenosaunee entered Montreal unarmed to negotiate with the French. But their much larger army stood at a distance, resolved to attack if the negotiators were maltreated. The Haudenosaunee had every reason to be suspicious of the French. This meeting resulted in what's been called a Treaty of Neutrality, where Outreuti and 21 other Haudenosaunee leaders placed their signatures on a document signifying their intention to observe a perfect neutrality between both England and France. To mark their intentions, they all drew their clan signatures on a treaty document, which you could see on the slide here. This declaration of neutrality assured the French that the Haudenosaunee were indeed accurately not a subject of the English crown, a political stance that helped to ease tensions between the Haudenosaunee and New France. Indeed, the Haudenosaunee were willing to have a relationship with both France and England if their autonomy was respected and they were recognized as allies rather than subjects. By entering Montreal unarmed, the Haudenosaunee negotiators risked a great deal to advocate for their brethren who had been captured the previous year. As Father Lambertville observed, quote, their desire to get back their compatriots who had been treacherously put in irons and taken to the galleys in France caused them to take this measure and risk themselves upon the word of the governor and ours, end quote. However, the Onondaga, Oneida, and Cayuga warriors just outside the French settlement also probably helped with the situation. Father Lambertville even remarked, quote, that their little army remained 2 leagues away, firmly resolved to avenge their people if they were maltreated, end quote. The Haudenosaunee delegates squeezed a major concession from the French, the return of 91 captives held at the La Montagne mission. While 36 Haudenosaunee had been sent to the galleys, the ones we've been talking about, many of the women, children, and elders captured by Denonville were being held at the Christian missionary community of La Montagne near Montreal. So the return of these captives was a diplomatic victory for Outreuti and the other leaders. This next slide here is just to show you those clan signatures again. The first time I showed you on the slide, that was actually a digitized scan from a microfilm. This is a photo of the original archival documents that are held in the French colonial archives in Aix-en-Provence in the south of France. So I just got these a few days ago, and they're much clearer than the digitized microfilm scans. So I wanted to share that with the audience as well. So in late 1687 and early 1688, Haudenosaunee leaders met several times with the governor of New York, a guy called Thomas Dongan, to ask for his help in recovering prisoners in French custody. We see the Mohawk representative open the talk by saying, and I quote again from the slide, "The governor of Canada hath begun an illegal war upon us without provocation or cause. He throws his axe everywhere and exercises acts of hostility upon all people without respect of persons," end quote. Haudenosaunee speakers, as we see in these council minutes, fixated on the axe hatchet idiom to denote the cessation or outbreak of hostilities between nations. An Onondaga leader likewise declared that the French had fished up the hatchet from the river and had used it to surprise their people at Fort Frontenac. Haudenosaunee delegates at this meeting produced a list of names of their most prominent leaders who had been sent overseas to France, hoping that the English would be able to effectuate some results on their behalf. When Edmund Andros replaced Governor Dongan in August of 1688, the Haudenosaunee were quick to reiterate their concerns for their brethren who were being held overseas. Around this time, we see an Onondaga leader named Delegates take a leading role in advocating for the return of the Haudenosaunee overseas. Delegates addressed the New York governor, referencing, quote, "that several of our Indians were stolen by the French in a time of peace and sent prisoners to France, and therefore we desire you to write beyond the sea so that we may have the same Indians back again," end quote. Delegates then presented a belt of wampum with 28 sticks tied to it to show the number of their relatives who had been taken overseas. For their part, both Governors Dongan and Andros made a concerted effort to redeem the Haudenosaunee prisoners in French custody, writing several times to the government of New France after their initial meetings with Haudenosaunee leaders. So I've read a lot of this sort of back and forth between the governor of New France, governor of New York, and then, of course, the respective metropolitan governments overseas. I think what's most interesting here, though, is that we see some Haudenosaunee leaders willing to put the negotiations for the return of their people partially in the hands of the English governor of New York, who they knew was in communication with these governments overseas. And ultimately, in 1689, I think largely thanks to the increased military pressure against New France, but perhaps also diplomatic pressure as well, plans were made to return the Haudenosaunee captives to Canada. The following month, a list of names was drawn up of the Haudenosaunee captives. Presumably, they were all who had survived the ordeal of the original 36. So you can see the list of names here transcribed along with the original document from the French National Archives on the right, which I was very fortunate to consult in Paris in April 2023. So on May 9th, 1689, the Haudenosaunee captives left Marseille with their escort bound for Rochefort, where they would then again cross the Atlantic. Orders were sent to the French officials at Rochefort to prepare for their arrival. And as you can see from the quote here, the intendant at Rochefort was told to take care to dress them nicely without spending a lot of money, but still take their taste into account. And I think most tellingly, he also says, quote, "His Majesty is very happy to use these Indians to make peace with those of their nation, not being appropriate to continue this war in the present situation," end quote. So this is a clear indication of France's war weariness and desire to end the conflict with the Confederacy. While the Haudenosaunee captives may have been given nice but not expensive clothing, they were not able to depart from Rochefort immediately. Ships were meant to leave by June 14th, but due to a variety of factors, including difficulty in securing crews and contrary winds, meant that they did not leave until July 23rd. Unfortunately, while the ships were being outfitted and the crews assembled, at least one Haudenosaunee fell sick and died at the Royal Naval Hospital of Rochefort on May 31st, 1689. The hospital death record, which you can see the the types of handwriting I'm trying to deal with here on this project, indicates that this Iroquois was brought to the hospital in a critical condition and was administered the last rites before dying the same day, and was buried the following day in the cemetery adjoining the Naval Hospital. So far, this has been the only evidence that I have found for a Haudenosaunee death and burial on French soil. But we know that there were certainly more, for only 13 of the original 36 touched foot on North American soil in October of 1689. So what had happened to the other captives then? French contemporaries give us some indication. We have the Baron de la Hontan, who was a French military officer, and he was very critical of the arrest and imprisonment undertaken by Governor Denonville. And La Hontan surmised that only some of the Iroquois came back, the rest having perished in their chains. Father Lambertville, who we've mentioned a few times, notes that they were carried away to France where they died from destitution, except 13 who were brought back because their compatriots were going to avenge this treachery. Another clear indication that it was the Haudenosaunee raids and military action that had effectuated the return of the captives. Indeed, it's likely that they perished from various disease epidemics that circulated throughout Europe in the 17th century, like measles, smallpox, influenza, scarlet fever, and these diseases, unfortunately, have claimed the lives of many Indigenous sojourners and captives in European metropoles over the previous centuries. So, conclusion, how do I sort of make sense of all this and give it, I guess some cohesion? I think on one hand, this is a really terrible story, right? Where the French caused a lot of suffering towards the Haudenosaunee people. It begins with Governor Denonville leading an army to invade their homeland. But before that even happens, he arrests and imprisons hundreds of people. Of those prisoners, he selects 36 men to send to France to labor in the galleys. Of that number, only 13 eventually make it back home to North America. The late 1680s were some of the darkest hours for the Haudenosaunee. Their villages and cornfields in the Seneca country lay smoldering. Their villages on the north shore of Lake Ontario lay abandoned and emptied. And hundreds of men, women, and children were being held in French captivity. Despite the tragic circumstances, the Confederacy's leadership worked to pressure the French colonial government through both military force and diplomatic means to return their relatives from France. I argue that the eventual return of the Haudenosaunee galley slaves had everything to do with their relatives back home in North America, exercising their own strategies and agendas. The Confederacy's leadership showed the French that they too could resort to captive taking and ransoming for strategic reasons. They also besieged the very French fort where their own people had initially been taken captive, as both a symbolic gesture and as a tactical ploy. In this instance, I think the decentralized nature of Haudenosaunee governance and leadership was strategically beneficial for other leaders like Outreuti and Delegates took more diplomatic approaches to the problem, right? Outreuti and others signed that Declaration of Neutrality in Montreal, and Delegates went and appealed to the governors of New York to intervene on their behalf. Ultimately, Haudenosaunee actions in North America had remarkably overcome and disrupted France's mobility-oriented punishment network of the galley fleet that spanned across the Atlantic world. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Scott, I think I speak for all of us when I say a very sincere thank you for sharing your very significant and meaningful research.
Thank you.
And also wishing you all the best in all of your travels around France and the continuation of this important work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today. If anybody has any questions for Dr. Berthelette, you are more than welcome.